Alright, welcome back to Way of the Wrench. Today's video, we're going to take a step back. Before I start talking about ignition coils and distributors and that kind of thing, I thought, this is kind of pointless unless my viewers have an idea of what electricity is. So think of it this way. If a little kid came up to you and asked you what electricity was about and you couldn't answer them, then this video is for you. So stay tuned. Alright, here you go. This is electricity. Well, kind of. It's kind of being stored inside of a battery. And it's kind of like potential energy. We can't really use it right now, but if we hook it up to a circuit and ask it to do some work, then we'll have some electricity. And then we have electricity. Well, once again, kind of, right? I know I have this plugged in, but there's no light. There's nothing being used. So do we have electricity? Not really. So if I turn something on though, well, now I've got something powered. I have a flow of electrons and they're being used up and being converted into light energy. So we have electricity. But this is one of the hard things to teach people because electricity is kind of abstract. You have to kind of go off of rules and logic and not actually see it. There's electrons flowing. Very hard to see. Aha! But this is electricity. Woo-hoo! And this is electricity too. So if you were to ask somebody a long time ago what they thought electricity was, well, they probably just used their kind of references in real life and what they thought electricity could be. And back in the day, you might actually think that there was some being or God up in sky chucking down lightning bolts. And so this is conventional theory. People think that electricity goes from the positive down to the ground in this format. And in fact, when you look at modern wiring diagrams and electrical schematics, it even still represents some of the symbols in this old way of thinking, which is conventional theory. All right, we're going to back up a little bit and go right back to elementary school and review some stuff on magnets really quickly because it's important for the function of electricity. So if you remember a term that your teacher taught you, that opposites attract. So we got a north and a south pole of a magnet. I'm just using rare earth magnets. They are attracted to each other because they're opposites. However, similar magnetic poles repel each other. So they don't like each other. They want to get away from each other. So, very important concept going forward. Okay, now that we know that opposite attract each other, then if we replace the north and south poles of a magnet with a positive charge something and a negative charge something, we've got opposites. They should be attracted to each other, which they are. Now, the problem is, do we know what's attracted and what's moving in our circuits? And this is where we get into a discussion about conventional versus electron theory. So which way does the electricity flow? Well, in the old days, we had an idea about electricity coming down from the heavens being thrown in forms of lightning bolts to ground, which is another kind of slang term for a negative charge. And so they thought that the positive charge somethings were going towards the earth, going towards our ground. Now, in recent times, we have understood what's going on a little better. So now we know that electron theory is to be correct. And electron theory states that the negative charge stuff goes towards the positives. Now, what could be our positive and negative stuff? Well, let's talk about atoms. So now when you take any single element found on the world and you break it down to its smallest basic level, you get to something called an atom. Now, every single element is going to have different varying amounts of these electrons and protons and neutrons, but so for right now, we're just going to talk about a basic idea of what it makes up an atom. So in the center of each atom is protons and neutrons. Protons are positively charged, neutrons aren't charged at all, they're neutral. And orbiting around those are electrons, which are negatively charged particles. Now, in this diagram, it looks like they just go in one circle, they orbit all over the place. Okay, now that we know the basic structure of an atom, let's start looking at some elements and what makes them different. So, for all intents and purposes, we are going to draw our proton and our neutron, and then we're going to just make up an atom here. We've got rings that these electrons fly around in. And there can be multiple rings, and these rings are actually called shells. And there can be varying amounts of electrons flying around in each of the shells. Now, the outer shell is the only one that we are concerned about, and it's called the valence shell. Okay, now though, when we're talking about electricity and atoms, the only shell that we need to be concerned about is this last outer shell, the valence shell. So in future drawings, this is all we're going to be drawing. So we have our outer valence shell that we're going to be talking about going forward here. And for all intents and purposes, this is not a in-depth discussion on atoms and going into all that stuff. This is just what we need to know for electricity and have a really good understanding of it, actually. So for this, we are going to just say that the maximum amount of electrons that can be in this valence shell is 8. Okay? All right, now this valence shell is always trying to become stable. Now, it can do this a couple different ways. If it can get another electron from something else and get 8, that makes it really stable, makes it really happy. If it can get rid of all of them, and so that the next shell down is more stable, then it will do that. All right, so the next important thing in regards to electricity to talk about is the terminology of conductors and insulators. So if an element is a good conductor of electricity, then it allows electrons to pass freely. And so most elements that are good conductors will have a valence shell with 1, maybe 2, maybe even 3 of these electrons. And good conductors want to get rid of their electrons. So if another atom is short some electrons next to it, it tries to pass them on. It tries to get rid of them so it can get to the next stable shell underneath it. Now, if an element is a good insulator, it's the opposite. The outer shell usually has 8 or 7 or maybe even 6 electrons in its outer valence shell. And if it can grab an electron from a neighboring atom, and it can fill that up and become stable, at that point it does not want to accept any electrons from any other neighboring atoms, and it does not allow electricity to flow, so it is an insulator. Just a note, a weird one, we don't need to know this, but if an atom is somewhere in the middle, so 4 or 5 or maybe even 3, but usually 4, these ones are weird ones, they're called semiconductors. They can kind of do both. They can be a conductor or an insulator depending on certain criteria, but we're not going to get into that. Now what I've drawn here is an element that is a really good conductor. So let's say something like copper, which has 1 electron in its outer valence shell. And when you put these atoms right next to each other, those electrons want to get rid of them so they can become stable. So one shares to the other one shares to the other one, and they continue to just kind of take and pass on those electrons. And they call this a electron cloud. It's full of a bunch of free electrons that are kind of free to go, especially when there's some kind of force applied to the element. So now we're getting closer to the point of what is electricity? Well, electricity is the flow of electrons. Okay, so for going forward with any drawings from now on, we don't need to have all the atoms and talk about valence shells and that kind of thing. We now know that electricity is the flow of electrons, so in all of our diagrams going forward, we're just going to draw electrons because that's all we're concerned about. All right, so I've quickly drawn up a diagram of an automotive circuit so that we can talk about the 4 basic things that every circuit needs. So first up is a source. So in this case, this is a battery. This is where we are getting our electricity from. Next thing is a pathway. We need to have a pathway for our electrons to flow and go back to the battery. So in this case, this could be electrical wiring, or it could also be your engine chassis or your frame, because all of that is attached to your negative terminal of your battery as well. Next up is a control. So in this case, this is a switch, but we need some way of controlling how the electrons flow. When, on, off, how many, etc. And then the last thing in a circuit is our load. Now this is the symbol for a light bulb, but it could also be a motor, it could be a heater, speaker, etc. So source, pathway, control, load. Now I've also drawn in little negative electrons here to talk about the electron theory again, just to make it make sense. So we have electrons that are coming from the negative side of our battery, and they are attracted to the positive side of the battery. So when we close this switch, we have electrons starting to flow through the wire Going through the load, it's going to do some work and make some light, and then going through the closed switch, and then getting to our positive side of the battery. Okay, moving along, we have some terminology for electricity that we have to learn so that we understand this stuff really well. So, first term up is voltage. So, voltage is the measure of potential energy measured between 2 points. I like to think of voltage as pressure. Okay, and voltage is measured in volts, and the abbreviation for that would be a V. Now, the next terminology we need to know about is current. And when we're talking about current, I like to think of current as the physical amount of electrons flowing through a circuit. So it's a flow thing, how little or how much electrons are going through a circuit. So I like to think of that as the flow. Okay, and then the unit of measurement for current is the amperage, and the unit of measurement for that is an amp. And the last one we need to know about is resistance. Now, resistance is when the electrons are trying to flow, something is restricting or resisting the flow of electrons. Now, the unit of measurement for resistance is the ohm. And the unit symbol for that is the omega. Now, there's a weird relationship that happens between these three things. And a long time ago, a guy named Ohm made Ohm's Law to show the relationship between these three. Through some experimentation, Ohm figured out and developed a law that understood the relationship between these three things. So, he found that whenever voltage went up, current went down. Or vice versa. If the current went up, then the voltage went down. So there was an inverse relationship between these two, and it was based off of what the resistance was in the circuit. Ohm was able to figure out a mathematical formula to be able to prove his theory and his concepts. And his formula for Ohm's Law is V equals I times R. V standing for voltage. I is actually current, because you got to remember that Ohm was German, and in German, I stands for intensity, so the flow of the electrons, or the intensity, how much and how many. So I is current and R is resistance. Now, if you're good with math, there's your math formula. If you're more a visual-based learner, then you got your magic triangle here from elementary school. So this line represents divide, this line represents multiply. And so you got voltage, current, and resistance. So to put this into concepts that we can test this out, if you've got a battery in your car, that's 12 volts. It's actually a little higher, 12.7 is a good volt, but we're going to just round it down to 12 volts. And we want to power a light bulb. We're going to put a new light bulb into the circuit into the car. And we've measured the light bulb resistance to be 2 ohms. But we need to figure out what size fuse goes into this, which is amperage. So we're going to put our hand over the I, and then we're left with the 2. So voltage divided by resistance will give us our current. So 12 volts divided by 2, that's 6. So in this scenario, this light bulb should draw 6 amps. Now, if we put a fuse that was 6 amps into a circuit for this, we'd probably blow it pretty quickly because we're right on the cusp. So most engineers have to design a safety factor into that kind of stuff. So usually it's about 1.5. And so if you add half of 6, which is 3, so then you end up 9 amps. And usually you probably round that up to 10. So this light bulb would get a 10 amp fuse. So when we're talking about electricity, I love to use the water analogy. So instead of thinking of electricity as electrons flowing through a circuit, think of it as water flowing through a circuit. When we're talking about voltage, remember that voltage is like pressure. So the distance that that water can shoot out is the pressure in this system. Now, current is going to be the flow, so the physical amount of electrons flowing through a circuit, or in this case, the physical amount of water that can come out of this. Now, the term that's going to change these two is resistance. So right now, there is a certain amount of pressure and a certain amount of flow based off of the restriction, which is the size of this hose. So remember that resistance changes our voltage and our current, and they have inverse properties. So if I put my finger over half of the hole of the hose that's changing the restriction, changing the resistance. And let's see what happens. So you can see that the pressure has gone up quite a bit. So, but because I'm restricting how much water can go through physically with my finger, I'm also limiting how much flow is coming out. So increase in pressure, decrease in flow. All right, so imagine if I have to fill up this bucket. Right now, I'm going to be able to physically fill this bucket faster because I'm allowing the maximum amount of flow based off of this restriction. But if I put a larger restriction in it, I have way increased pressure, but my flow is a lot less, and it's going to take a lot longer to fill up this bucket. So, voltage is pressure, how far it shoots out, how much power there is, and current is the physical amount that's flowing out, and resistance is the restriction. What's limiting that flow and changing the pressure? So here's an example of a series circuit. Now series means simply that there is only one pathway for those electrons to flow through our circuit. And if anything happens to that pathway, then the circuit doesn't work. So a really common example of this from back in the day was if you had a whole bunch of Christmas tree lights and one of those bulbs went, then the electricity pathway was broken and all of your lights would not work. And so you'd have to go through and find out exactly which one it was and replace it before you could have them work again. So for example, we've got a series circuit here. Both light bulbs are working, but if one pops, burns out, or basically pathway gets taken out, then you can see that that load and any other loads in the circuit can't work because the pathway has been broken. Okay, here we have a parallel circuit. Now a parallel circuit means that there is two or more pathways for the electricity to travel. And so in this situation we've got two light bulbs and there's two pathways for the electrons to go to be able to get to the positive of our battery. So parallel circuit. Now if one of these bulbs blows, the other one still goes because the electrons still have a pathway for the electricity to go. So you often find headlight bulbs and taillight bulbs in cars set up in a parallel circuit so that you don't lose all your bulbs when one of these breaks. So do you remember me talking at the beginning of this video that electricity is hard to teach and hard to learn about and hard to see, right? We can't see electrons moving here. We know they're moving because we've learned that if there's a light bulb going here, we have electrons flowing, and when there's not a light, there's no electrons flowing. But besides that, we have no way of really knowing what's going on unless we use a multimeter. Right, so now I'm going to show you how to check for the voltage or the pressure in this circuit. So we're going to use a multimeter here. Now the first thing we need to know is how to set this up. So we've got a black and a red terminal. The black always goes into the COM, sometimes they're color coded, and the red for doing voltage, you can see the V there, is going to go in there. Okay, now the next thing is we need to turn it to the voltage. So we've got V with the straight line, so that's the one we want. That stands for direct current, which is most of the stuff on a car. Especially just straight from the battery stuff. And then do not put it on the V with the squiggly line. That stands for alternating current, and that's more house stuff and some other things on cars, but the most one is DC. Now we know that a car battery is about 12.7, so we're going to go to the 20 scale, so it measures everything up to the 20 scale. Now when we are checking for voltage, there's a couple things. We're actually checking a voltage drop. Now I'm probably going to make some videos for this later, but when you are measuring for voltage, you are measuring a voltage drop. Or a different way of looking at it is a drop in pressure from 2 points. So if I measure from the red plus positive terminal of our battery to the negative, you can see that I'm getting 12.6 volts. Okay, that is measuring that there is a pressure drop of 12.6 volts between these two spots. Now I can put this somewhere else to measure the pressure drop between somewhere else. So for example, we have two light bulbs. I can check how much voltage pressure has dropped from just this bulb by going to here. So you can see it's 6.64. Whereas if I go after the second light bulb, I'm getting closer to the full amount. And that's because this is a series circuit. One light bulb is using half the voltage pressure drop, and then the other light bulb is using the rest of it up. So that by the time you get to the end of the circuit and back to the battery, that's our total pressure drop, our total voltage drop of 12.6 volts. Now note that I didn't take anything apart on this circuit. I'm actually supplying a parallel circuit for the electrons to flow. So there's the base circuit for the electrons to flow, and then I'm applying a parallel circuit when I'm checking for voltage. Now to check what the amperage is in this circuit, or the flow of electrons going through this circuit, I actually have to put this multimeter in series with the circuit. The physical amount of electrons have to go through this multimeter and back into the circuit in order to check the amperage. So we have to break the circuit somewhere. And setting up the multimeter, we've got to do something different here. So the black still stays in the COM, but the red now has to jump depending on how much amperage you have flowing. Now, a rule of thumb for me, I always go to the higher scale, because if you have more than 200 milliamps, which is what's rated on this port, you'll blow an internal fuse and then you'll have to take it apart and fix the fuse. So this one, if I put it over here, will measure up to 10 amps. So rule of thumb, I always go to here. Now for amperage, we're over here, and like I said, we're going to go right up to the 10 amp. Alright, so now if I put the red on this end and the black one on this end, you can see how much amperage is flowing. Well, wait a second, it's still 0. Well, that must mean that there's no electricity, there's no electrons actually physically flowing through the meter. So, got to turn it on. Notice the light's off. There's no pathway for the electrons, but as soon as I connect this, the light's going to go on and give us the actual flow, what's going through here. So in this case, we're using 0.97 amps through this multimeter. So the amperage for the circuit is 0.97 amps, and the light bulbs are going. So we have physical electricity flowing through this. Now, something really, really important to note, whenever you are done measuring for amperage, you should always switch this back to the voltage side, and here's why. If you just leave this and you put it in your toolbox and someone comes along and goes, I want to measure voltage of my battery, but they don't even change any of the settings, they're still checking for amperage, and they go over to here and they put it on here. Now all of a sudden they're checking the amperage of your battery, which could be 600, 700, 800 amps, and guaranteed every single time you're going to blow the fuse inside. So if you're done measuring for current, always switch it back over and turn it to the off. Okay, last one to figure out how to measure with your multimeter is resistance. So setting it up here, you need the black and the COM, just like everything else, and then the red, you can see the little omega symbol right there, so that's where that one's got to be. And then on here, the omega symbol is the green section, and we're going to start with the lowest. So it measures up to 200 ohms. Now whenever you're doing resistance checks, you should always confirm that your meter is okay, and you do that by basically touching the leads together, and you should get a very, very low number. A really good meter will go right to 0. If it's got a little bit of resistance there, it's measuring the resistance that's physically in the wires going to the multimeter, but that should be really low. If it's really quite high, then you've got some bad leads. Alright, and that should go to 1 when they're separated, so we've tested our meter here. Now, to be able to check the resistance of, let's say, this bulb, I need to break the circuit, put one end on one end of the bulb, one end on the other, and you can see there that this light bulb and this wire included, because we're not checking right at the bulb, is 1.6 ohms. If I wanted to measure the resistance for both of these bulbs and the wires included, then you just put one on the end, one on there, and we're roughly going to see double the amount of ohms. So 2.5 ohms, roughly double. Well, that's a wrap on another video from Way of the Wrench and our How to Become a Gearhead series. Hopefully you were able to get something out of the video and now have a really good, solid understanding of the fundamentals of electricity and how they work in your car. So the next time a kindergartner comes and asks you, what's electricity? Not only will you be able to answer them confidently, but probably to so much detail that you'll bore the crap out of them. So if you like the video, please, I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe. And until next time, take it easy.